This video was brought to you by Brilliant. When the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up back in September last year, no one was quite sure who was to blame. At first glance, the Kremlin's habit of weaponizing energy supplies made Russia the likeliest culprit. But it's not obvious what Putin actually stood to gain from destroying a pipeline that he could just, turn off on his own. And some commentators, including certain European politicians, speculate that it might instead have been the Americans, who've made their opposition to Nord Stream abundantly clear in the past. Unsurprisingly, the White House denied this claim, as did Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell when we asked him about it at Munich Security Conference this weekend.
A final kind of topic on Ukraine. Some journalists and some politicians, including Republican Senator J.D. Vance, have entertained the notion that Biden and other senior figures in the administration were responsible for the attack on Nord Stream last year. Presumably you don't agree with that analysis, but who do you think the most likely culprit was for that?
I have no idea, but I'm sure it wasn't us.
Nonetheless, in the last couple of months, there have been a couple of developments which increase the probability that it was the US, including a report by renowned American journalist Seymour Hersh, published on his Substack just a week ago. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at the most recent developments on this story and try and figure out who blew up Nord Stream. By the way, before we start, if you want to check out our full interview with Mitch McConnell, where we discuss the US's current plans in Ukraine and look towards the prospect of conflict between China and Taiwan, then that is linked in the description. Anyway, let's start with a recap. On September 26 last year, there were 2 explosions at the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and 2 further explosions at the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Almost immediately, both Sweden and Denmark said that they believed the explosions were deliberate, but both were remarkably restrained in their criticism. Both insisted that it wasn't an act of war, and neither of them singled out Russia as the culprit. Nonetheless, most politicians and journalists did blame Russia first, and, fair enough. The Kremlin has proven itself willing to weaponize energy in the past, and blowing up a pipeline is exactly this kind of hybrid warfare that we've come to expect from Moscow. The Nord Stream attacks also occurred the same day as the opening of another undersea pipeline, Baltic Pipe, which would run from Norway down to Poland. And it came about months before another attack on 3 undersea internet cables connecting France to northern Africa, as well as an attack on 2 internet cables providing connection to the Shetland Islands. All of this together then looked like a threat from Putin, warning Europe that if they continued supporting Ukraine, Russia would damage more interconnectors, which would be pretty catastrophic, given that between 25 and 30% of European gas comes from Norway's undersea cables. And as such, commentators hypothesized that Sweden and Denmark weren't calling out Russia because if they did, that would probably mean an all-out war between Russia and NATO. However, as time has passed, there have been a couple of things which just don't add up. For starters, it's not really clear why Russia would blow up their own pipeline. Not least because blowing up Nord Stream completely rules out the possibility of any gas relationship with Germany in the future, which the Kremlin is apparently still holding out hope for. In fact, that's why they came up with a bunch of implausible technical excuses every time they reduced flows via Nord Stream last year, because, it gave them enough cover that if they wanted to resume trading after the war, they could just claim they fixed the pipe. Not only that though, but in the last couple of months, a few more facts have come to light that have muddied the waters even further. In late December, the New York Times reported that the Russians were quietly trying to fix the pipelines. Presumably because, as we mentioned a few seconds ago, they're still optimistic about a commercial relationship with Germany after the war's over. Then, in January, the US Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs told a Senate hearing that she was glad that Nord Stream 2 had been destroyed.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
Now, to be clear, this isn't an admission of guilt, but it's at least an odd way to talk about an attack on a NATO ally's strategic infrastructure. Nuland has made similar comments in the past too. She once said the EU, and in February of last year, both her and Biden warned that Nord Stream wouldn't go ahead if Russia invaded.
To Nord Stream 2, we continue to have very strong and clear conversations with our German allies, and I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
Then on February 8th, we saw the next big development, when Seymour Hersh published an article on his Substack claiming that an unnamed source told him that the US blew up the pipelines. For those of you who don't know, Hersh is a well-renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist whose reporting has generally focused on the US government's involvement abroad. Hersh's earlier work, including exposés of the My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, enjoyed widespread acclaim, but it's worth noting that his more recent reporting has been more controversial. For example, in the last decade, Hersh has claimed that Erdogan carried out sarin attacks in Syria, that there's, quote, something wrong with the official line on the Skripal poisoning, and that Pakistan actually had bin Laden in custody for 5 years before his killing in the US. Anyway, in his Substack article, Hersh claims that the Norwegian Navy and senior members of the Biden administration, including Biden, Nuland, Jake Sullivan, and Antony Blinken, cooperated to secretly plant a series of explosives on the pipeline during Boltops 22. A NATO military exercise that took place in June last year, then suggesting that these explosives were remotely triggered in September. Now, these claims have already caused a stir in Germany, where last week Die Linke and AfD demanded an official investigation into the attacks. However, there do seem to be more than a few holes in Hersh's story. For starters, the comments allegedly made by senior CIA officials in Hersh's article seem incredibly ill-informed, and Hersh seems to imply that now NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was a CIA informant during the Vietnam War, despite the fact that, well, Stoltenberg was 16 at the time. Secondly, Hersh claims that mine clearing was added to Boltop exercises to provide cover for Norwegian divers. But mine clearing has in fact become a staple of Boltop's exercises for some time now, and is certainly not suspicious. Thirdly, Hersh claims that divers would deploy off a Norwegian Alta-class mine hunter. But no such ship took part in Boltops 22, and the other mine hunting ships that were used didn't travel over or slow down near the site of explosions, at least according to open source intelligence, despite the fact that any such dive would take at least an hour. Fourthly, Hersh claims that these devices were triggered by a sonar buoy that would be deployed by a Norwegian P-8 surveillance plane. But while this is possible, P-8s don't enter active service until later this year, and according to Open Military Intelligence, no Norwegian P-8 plane has flown within 1,000 kilometers of the leaks. Now, to be fair to Hersh, there was an American F-8 in the area on September 26th, but it flew over Nord Stream 2 about 2 hours after the Danish Geological Service recorded the first explosion. And on this point, what seems more suspicious were the movements of a couple of Swedish Navy ships that were traveling in the region at about the right time, and regularly turned off their tracking devices. All in all then, Hersh's account is clearly too flawed to be definitive proof that the US did it. And the question of who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, therefore, remains a bit of a mystery. Ultimately, though, we all want to be that kind of person who learns something new every day. That's likely why you watch our videos. And that makes sense, because everyday learning keeps us sharp and makes us and the world around us more interesting. But the reality is that daily learning is hard to do, and that's where Brilliant.org comes in. That's because Brilliant.org is the best way to learn vital skills, like maths, computer science, and decision-making interactively. And Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to the latest artificial intelligence, data science, neural networks, and more, with new lessons added monthly and staying on top of the latest developments and trends that you hear about in the news and even in our videos. Plus, the course on the joys of problem solving is a particularly great start for our viewers, running through the fundamental decision-making processes that experts and even politicians make every day. Or at least the good ones do. So take a positive step in your learning and check out everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the special link in the description. Plus, the first 200 people of you sign up will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.